Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this steaming Monday edition of the Daily Friend, the long version, the live version. And I have with me, and I would like to welcome my two wise elders of the IRR. Better go to the big boss. John Endres, welcome. You have been moving, but you have moved sufficiently to get your internet up and running.
Yes, so thank you very much. You might hear some noises in the background. There's work being done around the house, but we are in the new place, and soon we'll have a new backdrop as well.
Well, noise, I'll raise you some jackhammers and angle grinders. Michael, I hope it's quiet on your side.
It is quieter, Sarah, and always a delight to join you. Great to see you too, John.
As you can see, I am filling in for the esteemed Nicholas Lorimer. So let's get ahead, because there is nothing quiet and serene about our politics, ever. So let's start. And we're going to start with a senior Volkswagen executive who's involved in global cost-cutting strategy, said on Friday. He was, quote, very worried, close quote, about the future of the company's operations in South Africa, and facing persistent power cuts and logistics snarl-ups. And I wonder which ports, railways he might be referring to in that respect. He's also said that the company's Volkswagen passenger car brand is in the midst of defining the key measures of a global scheme to boost its flagging margins. The first in a series of savings drives aimed at improving group profitability and staying competitive in the transition to electric vehicles. Now, this is a car maker that has been in South Africa for nearly 80 years. John, is this the beginning of the end of the big car companies in South Africa?
It could be, Sarah. I think what we tend to underestimate is to what degree we are exposed to global competition within multinationals. So if you're in corporate head office of Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, you've got a map of the world behind your desk, and it's got all your various production locations. And each of these locations has to justify its place on that map. So we are competing against Mexico, Brazil, probably maybe Slovakia, various other places around the world as well. Plus, also, Volkswagen is under a lot of pressure at the moment because of this transition to electric vehicles. So Tesla is growing very fast. Some Chinese electric car manufacturers are growing very fast. Volkswagen feels like it's missed the boat a bit. And so they're now rushing to catch up. So they're feeling the pressure, and they're looking at their big map with the various production places, and they're seeing South Africa down there, and they say, you know, every day we look at this place, there's red lights flashing. Like, we can't get our cars out from South Africa because the ports aren't working or the railways aren't working. Our production keeps being interrupted because of load shedding, or we have to invest extra money in order to keep production going. It's adding to our costs. Our labor relations might not be quite as smooth as we would like. And all of these things add up together. Plus, then also, if you've got a policy environment where the government makes it kind of tricky for you to invest, it doesn't make things easy for you, you really do ask yourself the question, as one of those head honchos in the big head office, whether you should keep the site going or not. Now, adding to that, these investments are very, very large investments. So if you want to build a car factory, it's millions and billions, not only of rands, but also of euros. It's very, very expensive. So ultimately, you really don't want to leave, right? You've got all that money sunk into the plant. You've trained people. You've got the established history. You want to stay in that location. And for you to even start to talk about wanting to leave is a sign, I think, of quite great distress and concern about the way things are going. So for this executive to have spoken up is a warning signal to us as a country. And we really hope that the government will take it seriously, because this is a serious sign. Sarah.
I think one of the, if you could sort of commit economic suicide more than once, this would be event number 35, because you're not only dealing with all the factors you've mentioned, but they're also, a lot of the car companies are situated geographically in areas that without them, they would be completely and utterly impoverished. I mean, there would be absolutely nothing no employment to live off. And it just, Michael, I think it just goes to show that if you start doing one thing wrong, or you take your eye off the ball, or you corrupt something, it's almost like it is a domino effect. Everything gets affected, everything gets corrupted. So whether it's a series of bad policies which ultimately will lead to certain business disadvantages, and then plus corruption or preferential procurement, cutting you off or cutting you out, or increasing the cost of doing business. It's I mean, the car companies, it's almost like, somebody's got to switch off the lights once they've gone, because will anyone be left?
Indeed. And just before dealing with the particular case of VW, I was immediately reminded, especially as you were speaking now, about the general conditions in which the economy is functioning and our politics is functioning. I was reminded of a very concise line in Jonathan Katzenellenbergen's piece last week on the Harvard report by a very significant grouping of academics at Harvard, looking at the South African economy and politics and identifying all the things that we constantly identify as being exactly what's the matter. And Jonathan had this short line, and I think it sums up a lot of what you've just been referring to. At their root, the causes for our economic demise are political. And it comes down to those policy choices, one after the next. The effect is compounding, it's an accumulating impact. We're going to deal with one of them in one of the latest stories in this show. But I think here we see at the coalface, where a company is actually operating in this kind of environment, it reaches a point where it's in a crisis. And there, just two phrases that Thomas Schaefer, the VW brand chief, used in describing VW's, dealing with this, grappling with this crisis. He says, eventually you have to ask, why are we building cars in a less competitive factory somewhere far away from the real market where the consumption is? I'm very worried about it. We are not in the business of charity. And quite right. That's absolutely right. He's identifying exactly what the problem is. That too many South Africans, too many parties in South Africa, political politicians and so on, members of the cabinet, have always kind of assumed that the business is here to serve them somehow, serve the country, do us favors. It isn't. That isn't how it works. It's a relationship. It's got to work. It's a vibrant economy. One thing I want to also touch on, which I think is very significant, and John brought it up too, is the shift towards electric vehicles and that whole kind of green economy. We differ with many of the underlying rationale of the whole kind of climate change debate, but I think it's undeniable that this is where the free market is moving. It's where banking is moving. It's where people want to be, and we have to be ready for that. We have, remarkably, we have the mines, we have the minerals, lithium and cobalt. I think Mr. Schaefer draws attention to this. But what we have standing in the way of all these, the potential to exploit this opportunity, is exactly the policy environment. It's mining law. It's all the restrictions there. It's labor. It's property rights. These are the things which we need to really wake up and address, or else we'll miss this opportunity, which in fact was also flagged by the Harvard report. Opportunity to make South Africa a kind of hub of new technology.
John, it strikes me that perhaps one of the problems with the government sort of allowing this to happen eventually is that business has been, as business tends to be, fairly conservative and willing to sort of take what the government gives for longer than we as individuals will take it. In other words, you've got a powerful grouping becoming critical possibly by the time it's too late. In other words, the damage has been done. Everyone else in the world where they have markets is becoming more competitive, and there's just no way we can't change things fast enough anymore, even if they're changed.
So I think the role of business is good to highlight in this discussion, and I think one of the possibly underestimated critical moments in South African history was when Des van Rooyen was appointed as the finance minister, and the banks appeared in the president's office and said, "So far and no further. We refuse to accept this." The president backed down. We got a different finance minister, and it showed, I think, the power of the business community which it is all too seldom willing to deploy. I do wonder whether there is a bit of a shift going on in the mindset in the business community. We see it in some companies, not so much others, but some, I think, are becoming a bit harder in the way that they deal with the government. And I think that is absolutely appropriate at this stage of the game. So one hopes that more companies will do that and engage in far more robust discussions and negotiations with the government. Sarah.
Well, we will welcome that. Robust is a very positive word in the climate. I think one of the problems is that generally business kind of forgets that, as in life, relationships are based on power, and power swings, and the business community might have let it swing a little bit too far. But not unrelated was a really interesting article in the Sunday Times by Mike Saluma, who's their deputy editor. And it was talked about the Harvard Growth Lab report and the constraints holding our economy back, and reviving the perennial issue of transformation. And so the issue then became for him is what comes first, the imperative to transform the economy or the urgency to fix and grow it. Now, I would say, Michael, that the two go hand in hand. You don't put one before the other. They go. In fact, if you look to fix the economy, transformation will happen faster and more effectively.
I think that's absolutely right. And as we were discussing before the show began, one of the points that I feel particularly strongly about is that it's a profitable business that has the most capacity to be transformative. That is actually what a transformative business is. It's one that is making money, that's succeeding, that is employing people, that's paying more tax, that's generating other downstream business and so on. It's one that is untrammeled, that is being able to exploit the fullest extent of its own dynamism, its technological innovation, innovation in branding, in producing things, in whatever it might be, whatever its field happens to be. But as long as it's untrammeled and it's capable, being allowed to make money and succeed, that is having a tremendously transformative effect on an economy. And I think perhaps a point to make before we get into some of the detail about what Mike Saluma is saying is that this is especially so, I think, for an economy that has a legacy of exclusion, that has a legacy of whatever you want to call it, inequality or disadvantage, and a desperate need for growth. This is one of the key things that IRR keeps saying. Growth is the only possible path out of the crisis we're in, and it's exactly for these reasons that instances like this, with senior journalists like Mike Saluma, a very experienced guy, my kind of generation, I think, has the courage, first of all, but also the kind of ability to think through things afresh. And he's giving permission, I think, to, in a sense, it's allowing people to begin to talk about this in a way that they might not have been able to 5 or 6 years ago. I think that terrible, I've written about it before, nodding, almost somnolent unanimity of so much of the intelligentsia, I think that's gone out of the way. Thankfully, people are now being challenged. You can't simply support race-based transformation and think that you're going to be applauded, because you're going to have somebody like Mike Saluma saying, but are you right? And people like us, obviously, we've been doing it all along. But I think it's significant that you've got this a very positive shift into an environment where we're asking questions about quite fundamental things. And of course, the third point, which I think is so important, and again, it relates very much to the position that we've taken for a long time, is that Saluma, I think he refers to this argument does not nullify the need for redress. And it's a shameful fact that the redress that was necessary has actually been deferred by the ANC. It hasn't been addressed in the least. It's been deferred for 30 years. They had 3 decades to actually get tackling this. And we've, for years, offered them the blueprint, and it's the economic development for the disadvantaged, economic empowerment for the disadvantaged. And it's a very, very thoroughly thought through process that addresses education, healthcare, housing, and how to incentivize business actually to be part of this process. And removes race entirely from the equation. So it focuses where the need is, and should the need not be there, the policy would not be necessary. This is fundamental to a rational approach to addressing the kind of economy we've inherited and the kind of economy we want to create. So I think a very significant story, and yeah,
I think so too. Yeah, I think so too. I think I mean, one of the things he does, and which indicates a sort of a little bit of pandering towards the, shall we say, his old audience on BEE, is he says that perhaps the word transformation is a swear word to the white and historically privileged. And it is a swear word, but it's a swear word because it says everything and nothing. It promises a huge amount, and the ANC has used it to the point where it just doesn't mean anything anymore. I would much prefer using the word change, because it's not as sort of idealistically aspirational, and B, that's really what it's about. It's about change, and change happened and then stopped happening and then reversed. And that to me is what's indicative of what needs to change in this discussion. And I think Mike Saluma being one of those people who's making those noises is crucially important to the society. What's, John, your comments generally, and what's your sense of someone like him particularly having an impact on the debate, of getting people writing articles in the Sunday Times saying BEE is a huge problem and those writers are not necessarily white?
I mean, that's super interesting, because I think a week or two ago I had dinner with a prominent advocate who I couldn't quite convince, I think, to give up his support for BEE and similar policies. I think I got close, so maybe over time we'll get there. But one of the challenges he posed to me, he said, which prominent black person is saying that BEE should be scrapped? And he, was sort of thinking there's not a single one. And I said, well, there are some, but they're usually not mainstream. It still positions you as an outsider, I think, to make this argument, as is happening with Mike Saluma. I'm hoping that over time that becomes more and more the case, as the fatal results of the policies we've tried so far become clearer and clearer. And what I detect also in Mike Saluma's really interesting piece is the uncertainty and nervousness that is brought about by the argument that emergent orders solve problems. So in other words, what our Michael Morris was saying just now is, you can absolutely get transformation, and look at countries like India or China, based on rapid economic growth. A country can change within a generation beyond all recognition, and that can happen here as well. But it is a bit scary, the notion of having to let go control of the process. So, from the government's point of view, let's say, but you're saying it's going to work out fine if we liberalize the economy and the labor market and let businesses operate, then this transformation will happen somehow. But we actually don't feel comfortable trusting the process, that this will be the result. We are worried that it's not going to happen. And therefore, we want to hold on to the process and sort of tell companies how they must racially change their mix, because we're scared that it won't work otherwise. The thing is that by now we're at a point where we can say, look, your tightly controlled process has not produced the results that you want. As Mike Saluma points out, there's a small group of people, black people, who have benefited from BEE, and they are typically the ones who reply to us when we call for its scrapping, and they say, how can you say this? My family, myself, we would not have been in this position without these policies. But the point is precisely that there are maybe 85% or more of black people who have not benefited, and as a matter of fact, are much worse off because of these policies. And they are the ones deserving of our attention and the attention of the government in terms of the policy mix that is introduced in order to address their problems. So the argument here is you have to let go of control. You have to believe in spontaneous ordering and emergent orders coming out of the process. That is what I think free markets have shown to be able to provide across the world, wherever they've been allowed to operate freely. This will work in South Africa as well, but you do need to have that leap of faith to say, okay, I'm going to let go of the process, let the economy grow, and trust that the transformation will come. That's a tough thing to do. but hopefully more and more people are now at the point where they are willing to try that. Sarah.
Michael, John raised an interesting point, because we've talked extensively about China and India, and they are proof of market liberalization and the successes it brings. They're also part of BRICS, and South Africa is invested heavily emotionally and ideologically in its membership of BRICS, and in having recently hosted the summit here. And there's nothing that I can think of often that follows the ANC's model anywhere else that has worked or showed it's worked by comparison. So it's like, how you can take a horse to water, but even China and India haven't been able to make them drink.
Yeah.
What do we need to get over? What do we have to do to get them to see that even in their own favored sphere economically of economics and groupings, they are proved wrong, essentially?
Yeah. I think, as John emphasizes, if we sustain this focus on the 80% of people who for 30 years have not benefited from a thing that was designed to uplift them, to give them the better life for all, that very clever slogan of 1994, and that now rings so tragically hollow for so many millions of people. As long as we do at the IRR, but other people are also beginning to do this, to point to these people and say, here are the people who've been failed by policy, and something better has to happen. And these other, it's a good point. We point to these other countries, and they are demonstrable instances of the success of the very thing that we are talking about. I think John's also right that it is a kind of leap of faith. Certainly from the IRR policies alternatives position or perspective, the one great example of the non-racial application of a key policy that we see playing out month after month is, of course, the SASSA grants that are delivered on a purely non-racial basis. So we're not actually suggesting something wildly revolutionary, or it's not going to be something entirely novel and different for South Africans. It is something that does actually work. We'll have to see how voters respond to all these things, but it will ultimately come down to people making up their own minds and choosing differently, choosing a different policy bouquet to deliver what they
and not
want.
being offended when the ANC calls us counter-revolutionaries.
That's a badge of honor.
Yeah, that's
yes,
let's luta continua, as they say. Now,
yes.
Quite a detailed article, but perhaps just going to the extremes of what the markets can do. And this, again, is reflective of failed policy, the failed realization of policing and dealing with crime and prosecuting that crime. And that are the extraordinary actions of construction mafia in Cape Town that literally, on behalf of their boss, who's now awaiting trial for murder together with his wife, I think, basically put up a video saying to the city council, give us your business or else. I mean, I'm putting it, a little simply, but essentially that was it. They were saying, you're not doing the right thing by the people, like they are representative of people, and we want your construction contracts. It's the most it's the most extraordinary thing I've ever. Nothing's extraordinary. Most extraordinary thing I've ever seen in South Africa. But it's basically while the gang boss is sort of out of commission, the acolytes or the 2ICs or whatever one calls them in that area have literally threatened people involved at a municipal and level, in fact, just down the corridor from Jordan Hill Lewis, the mayor's office, saying, give us a business or things won't look so comfortable for you. And this came literally not a week after one of the council officials was murdered near one of the sites that they're working on. So, John, what do we do with these guys? I mean, is this the only way you can do business is by literally pulling out a gun and threatening to destroy somebody's family if they don't give them the business that the businesses themselves have worked so hard to develop and employ people who need the employment. I mean, it's just astonishing.
It really is. And what underlies it is the fact that, in a way, the government itself is involved in the protection racket, because it promises to allow you to go about your business unmolested and keep you and your property safe in return for your implied contract. You pay your taxes, you elect your government in a democracy, and in return, you'll be able to operate safely. And this is now effectively the gangs muscling in on the turf of the government, and it will have fatal consequences for South Africa's economy if they're allowed to prevail. So Cape Town and the Western Cape is probably one of the jurisdictions where we have greater faith that the state will push back hard against this and not allow itself to be deprived of this really essential role in an economy. But in the rest of the country, I'm not so sure. So in the Western Cape and Cape Town, what I would expect to happen is that the authorities will not negotiate, that they will not agree to the terms that these bandits oppose, and that they will push back and not comply. The rest of the country, not so sure. And this is going to broaden the gap between the Western Cape and Cape Town and the rest of the country if the Western Cape prevails and the rest of the country does not. Sarah.
I was just waiting for my Hardidars to talk about gang warfare.
Is this your TPM, Hardidar, Sarah?
Yeah, they're not very, shall we say, obedient. I just saw. I mean, here you have a group. I actually found what I'm looking for is the video. It was titled, put on the G4D's Facebook page. This is the company, entitled "Firm Warning to the Mayor." I mean, and they are seen confronting the poor official during a protest in Mitchell's Plain and referring to the incident in February, i.e., the murder of this woman and their confrontation of him. Michael, what's really worrying is we've also just looked at the recent striking off the roll of the case against Majela Koko, who is the CEO and sort of very high position before that of Eskom. I mean, here's this huge corruption case. We are desperate to see somebody at some level convicted, provided the evidence is provided. And it's struck off because it's taken too long. The NPA hasn't been able to get ready for it and hasn't been able to prosecute it timeously. I mean, it can go back on the roll, but we keep hearing the same thing about the under-resourcing. Now, we know that the NPA is under-resourced, and we know that it's full of people who are making their own lives difficult to undermine the NPA. But at some point, something has got to change. And I know at some point the private sector offered to give what assistance they could to make the NPA's life easier. And I don't know if something's come of it, it either hasn't worked or it hasn't happened. I'm not quite sure which. But I mean, we've now heard that everyone but, and that includes the NPA, everyone but the VIP protection services is getting an increase on their budget. I mean, sorry to show sort of, incomprehension, but, a few less blue light brigades, perhaps?
Yeah, no, indeed. And the point that you made now, and John's point, that with the sort of decline in the standards, the efficacy of the fight against crime, which is a very serious problem generally in South Africa, but here in particular we see a particular kind of it. The greater legitimacy is actually lent to criminal procedures because there are no consequences. People get away with it on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the implicit legitimizing of this kind of stuff through the 30% BEE segment that's got to go to the local community. So people read these things as kind of permission to, if they don't not getting the goodies, they're allowed to muscle in and try and extract something for themselves. They're not going to be consequences. The cops won't be there. They won't be charged. They won't, and so on. So I think it's a very dangerous thing. It potentially becomes almost impossible for any business to operate properly. It's the costs are mammoth, the extra costs of security. Companies maybe just not even going for certain contracts because of the particular circumstances that lift the risk level to an impossible high. So just all round, it's a very, very bad thing. It ties in with everything else we've been speaking about. It's just one more consequence. I kind of made a note of it earlier that, as often happens, we see in these shows the unignorable patterns of things that speak to politics, society, and to policy making and the economy, and they're all come together in stories like this one, where the consequences of the way we've allowed things to develop are coming home to roost and come home to roost at a very high cost.
And just quickly, John, to say that the threats were made in February, or as a consequence of what happened in February, and the police have been investigating it ever since. And policing is a national competence, not as it would appear. Surely something like this, I mean, video evidence is wonderful. It answers a whole lot of questions immediately. So where are the charges?
Yeah, good question. And that really, I think, we're going full circle in the sense that we started out with investment and VW being worried about the sustainability of their investment here. And, the really basic requirement for an investor is to know that their assets, that they can keep their assets, generate a profit and, get the profit to wherever they need them to be. But if you have to live in fear of your assets being stolen, as well as your profits, then you're not going to invest in a jurisdiction like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think I shall become wordless and end this esteemed elder wisdom event and show that we don't really have all the answers, but the RR certainly has some of them. And hopefully your regular admired host, Mr. Lorimer, will be back in the chair for the rest of the week. Keep well and hold tight.